Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. Welcome to the Cameron Journal Newshour. It has been a day. um, Not that most people will have noticed, but this morning I woke up to no website. CameronJournal.com was down, kind of. Um, and I couldn't access it. I can get it to load up all this type of thing. And I last year I moved my website hosting to more inexpensive hosting in Germany, and so I had to get on the phone to my German friend and get on the phone to the hosting and get a hold of English support because I don't speak enough German to deal with website stuff. Um, and I, after 5 hours and many phone calls and trying to figure out what the problem was and all this type of thing, I eventually did get the website back up and running. Had Didn't even know the problem was a problem, and then eventually figured it out. So it was fun. It was an adventure. It did kind of tucker me out though. I woke up ready to seize the day and get writing and do a bunch of things. I did a lot of things today, but was not quite the day that I had planned on or was hoping for. Um, and so it's been a bit of a we're kind of crashing into the news hour tonight, because it's just been a lot and so overwhelming um, and just a lot happening and a lot going on, and it's a lot 'cause it's a lot. It's kind of one of those things in life, but we're back up and running at CameronJournal.com, so that's really great. I had a great weekend. I hope you did too. My weekend was very relaxing. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm suffering kind of the long term effects of long COVID fatigue, or if we're just in burnout. I'm starting to think it's a little bit of burnout. Um, and so I took the weekend off. I feel great today. Well, I did until the website mess. But I did get some content ready for you, so we're gonna have some great threads this week on a lot of different topics. Some great articles. We have two great interviews today. One is from who is it? It's Eric Feinberg, I think. Um, who's the dentist? Okay, so this one's a little bit weird. Edward Feinberg. So this one's a little bit unique. Edward is a dentist in Southern California. And he is talks about your dental health and dentistry and kind of what's wrong with dentistry. It's kind of another in the long line of interviews that I've done on like healthcare and all this sort of thing, which was just all very interesting. And it was kind of one of those things. It was a bit of an unexpected interview, like, but I thought it was kind of interesting all the same. And then the other one we have that's very important is Robert Cook. We did a recording with him this week, and we're talking about drones, AI, drone strategy, all this type of thing, which is really cool. So, if you're on YouTube or elsewhere, make sure to check those out. They'll be posted everywhere: YouTube, Facebook. Clips will be coming out shortly. We'll make sure to check those out. If you want to support the channel, make sure to stop by CameronJournal.com and sign up for Cameron Journal Plus. We're starting our post news hour Discord hangouts here soon, which is really exciting. I'm also I also wanted to remind everyone that if you are interested in writing a book or studying philosophy, I haven't talked about this enough, but I've recently started what's called the Cameron Journal Academy, and it is kind of the learning annex of the Cameron Journal. The next course I'm working on is on civics, which I think is gonna be a lot of fun. But uh, I am just it's really exciting because we have two courses on writing, The Power of Story, and we have a course from Dan Sanderson on philosophy around his book Reimagining Plato. And so I haven't, like I said, talked about this nearly enough, but if you want to get into writing, you have a book you want to write, book you want to work on, manuscript you want to work on, questions about self-publishing, all this type of thing, I have two great writing sources. Um, for the power of story. And then for my philosophy people, if you're into Platonic philosophy and you want to understand Dan Sanderson's the book's called Reimagining Plato, and the course is the same name, then I can't recommend that philosophy course enough. If you want to learn more about Dan and the way he's thinking, over at CameronJournal.com, you can click on philosophy. He's currently doing a series. He's an executive contributor with us. He's currently doing a series on his book and reactions to another friend of the show, Wade Franson, and that sort of thing. So that's really exciting. So if you haven't had a chance to check out Cameron Journal Academy, please do so. It's all at CameronJournal.com. So it's really exciting. It's a lot of fun. We have some new courses coming down the line. I've been working with a lot of people to build their courses and launch them with the Cameron Journal Academy. So I think it'll be really spectacular. So yes, so that's kind of all the housekeeping stuff, announcements, all this type of thing, and updates, which means we can dive right into the headlines. But before that, as I'm sure everybody knows, what the big news story has been today and how crazy things have been. Obviously, Trump's tariffs went in place on April 2nd, and China announced reciprocal tariffs on Friday. That led us into the weekend. Last night, futures were down in the basement. There's been a huge sell-off. Even by Saturday, it was $6 trillion. And people expected kind of more blood in the water today. Surprisingly enough, even though last night, as Asian markets opened, you had dramatic falls in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan, which all triggered circuit breakers that stopped trading. The day for American stocks actually kind of ended okay. I was just kind of looking at the stock market closed 3 hours ago, but I was busy. So, I was just looking at kind of the last numbers, on the day, and the S&P was only down 0.23. The Nasdaq ended up 0.1. The Treasury's 10 years down to 4.8. Oil is up a little bit to 61.34, and gold obviously is up a little bit too. So, although everything kind of was a little crazy and we had a little bit of a moment, it actually wasn't quite the Black Monday bloodbath that we anticipated. I was looking even at the Dow, which is not on my Bloomberg, although it should be. One of these days I need to invest in a Bloomberg terminal. The Dow Jones today was down only 349. And the NYSE is right here, and it was only down 179. So actually, all things considered, not quite the completely disastrous Black Monday that we thought it was going to be, and not quite as awful as we thought it was going to be. Although this whole thing with the tariffs has triggered a whole new level of conversation about tariffs, Trump, young people, 401ks, cost of living housing crisis, reindustrialization, saving the middle of the country. I mean, there's so many narratives going on right now. So I'm not going to try to dive into all of those, but we're going to dive into some of them. So here we go. Let me get the right screen going. And then we're also going to dive into some other news stories, including one I have myself about my news story on domestic terrorism. We're going to stop by that as well. So here we go. So I want to start. No, we're not going to start there. We're going to start here with this really great Substack. Let me put my glasses on so I can read all this stuff. So kind of looking at one of the things about the Cameron Journal, I don't talk about this enough either. I talk about news as a narrative. That's why it's called a story. I say that all the time. although probably not enough here as I need to. And so this one I found it on Twitter. I looked it over and I was kind of like, this is interesting. This is an interesting. As we move through these different stories, I kind of want to show you the different aspects of this debate, bearing in mind with this whole Trump tariff situation, I've kind of been caught in between two things. Because, on the one hand, and this was pointed out on Twitter as well, it's strange to see Republicans talking about Occupy economics. Uh, the on kind of like the one hand, you have, I've always argued, yeah, we lost a lot of jobs. We should work on bringing, manufacturing back and all this sort of thing. And then I kind of evolved to understanding, well, that's probably not really possible due to the cost of labor. And we have to learn how to work and compete within a globalized economy, which is going to be education, it's going to be services, it's going to be trades, it's going to kind of be rethinking what the U.S. economy looks like. It's gig work, and we should have the social supports to support the economy we have, not the economy we wished we had. And so I've kind of been a bit torn on all of this because I think we're so integrated into the globalized economy that trying to undo that, which some would argue is what Trump is trying to do, and indeed what, some people say today is a harbinger of, um, that we that time has passed. Um, and perhaps this time we think in a different sort of direction. And so I've kind of been in the recent years, I've kind of been in the mind of, yeah, let's create the social supports that make different types of work possible, and yes, we should build housing and all this sort of thing. But I also recognize that in all the economic growth we've had in the last 20 years, the vast majority of it has gone to about a select set of about a dozen cities, mostly on coast, and the middle of the country's been left behind. That's part of the reason what the appeal of Trump was in 2016. I said it at the time. And I kind of looked at the national economy as sort of something where, yeah, I mean, we need to do something with the middle of the country, but it's social programs, not trying to rebuild the globalized economy. Well, here we are anyway. And I've kind of always joked that when it comes to the economic growth of the last 20 years or so, it's been in knowledge information jobs, which tend to be high Q. We have not created good quality, dignified jobs at the lower end of the intelligence spectrum, or as I sometimes crassly say, we forgot to make jobs for stupid people. And it's kind of funny because I've seen people on Twitter kind of coming around to that conclusion that, you need jobs that pay well but have a low barrier to entry. And those are not the jobs the economy has created for quite some time. Even the Obama administration complained of it. Like, yeah, we've created a lot more jobs, fast food and personal services and all this type of thing, but the pay is terrible and the indignity is worse. When it comes to, the jobs of putting bumpers on Fords and all this type of thing, we haven't been creating those jobs, and the ones that used to exist have been automated. What do we do? Well, Trump's solution, I don't think it's valid, but Trump's solution is to tariff imports, and which is a tax on the consumer, but to give domestic industry an advantage to compete against all of this. Do I think it's going to work? Probably not. As I talked last week in my new article from Brains Magazine, I kind of go through what Scott Bessent has been talking about and what they're trying to do. I don't think they're going to be able to pull it off, but that's certainly the idea of what's going to happen. That leads us to this, which is this kind of idea of MAGA communism. And so I want to get right into to this right here. The actual effect of the tariffs will be to halt the American economic juggernaut, discredit the anti-woke movement, pave the way for a left-wing populist like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, stop the right's momentum in other countries, and bring an end to Pax Americana, which is the masking tape holding the pieces of the world together. Historically, the American right was better than the left on economics, but as the Republican Party degenerated into a low IQ cult of personality, this was unsustainable. The benefits of free trade are counterintuitive and require a certain degree of intelligence to understand. On average, people who believe in capitalism have higher IQs. If you chase all the smart people away from your movement, your economic policies will come to reflect the intuitions of below-average people who think that trade is inherently exploitative and only workers who make physical objects add value. The base will demand that we return to a simpler time when Americans worked in factories, life was easier to understand, and we didn't have so many vaccines. Trump was elected largely because he was the anti-woke candidate. His executive orders on DEI were a cause for celebration. But the point of fighting DEI is to pave the way for something better, not merely to attack leftists for its own sake. If we destroy America and go back to living in caves, then we will have won the war on woke. But that's not the kind of victory we should aspire to. The goal is to bring about a better world. Here I will explain how MAGA communism is based on lies and delusions, and everything is about to blow up in our faces. A reality-based movement needs to accept the following facts. Until Trump came back, the American economy was better than ever. Income inequality has not increased since the 1970s. Taxes are paid mostly by the rich. People deny the aforementioned facts out of ignorance and or for political gain. Mob rule by ignoramuses is not an effective long-term strategy to fight wokeism. Don't agree with a lot of that, but let's continue. 100 years ago, Charlie Chaplin made films where he plays an industrious hobo who frantically runs around looking for work so he can afford to buy a piece of bread. Many people are under the impression that millions of Charlie Chaplins are running around America unable to catch a break, but that there was a golden age in the 70s when the average factory worker could afford a house, family, and car just on his own income. In reality, there has been an explosion in wealth since the 1970s. The kind of poverty that exists in the 70s, not to mention Charlie Chaplin's time, doesn't exist anymore. Yet people feel poor, in most cases because their desires have become inflated along with their standard of living. If you're an able-bodied person and think you can't afford to live the lifestyle of a Detroit auto worker in 1875, it's because you don't want to live like him, not because you can't buy whatever he had and more. There are a few methods to compare economic conditions across time. Consider GDP per capita, and then he goes into a bunch of numbers, and we're not going to go through all of that, because his point is that we're better off than we were. Here's a good bit. Economic progress isn't driven primarily by Charlie Chaplin screwing in bolts in an assembly line faster than before. It's driven by technological progress and greater efficiency. Efficiency is a matter of distribution of effort and resources. The Wall Street fat cats who extend credit, manage risk, and provide other financial services were instrumental in that. A philosophy of telling Wall Street to screw itself so Americans can return to factories is not going to lead to more wealth creation. Across borders, people are more efficient at producing different kinds of goods. Countries with cheaper labor have an advantage in producing labor-intensive products like fabric. More educated countries can produce advanced technology like cell phones. Then they trade fabric for cell phones and everyone gets something they want. Tariffs prevent free trade, which will reduce wealth. Ah, but wealth for who? Recently, a video came out of a man on the sidewalk in New York City eating a rat. The replies were full of people blaming the cameraman for not buying the man a hot meal, as if he had resorted to eating rats because there was no other food available. This shows how delusional some people are about the nature of poverty in the United States. I grew up in New York in the 90s and 2000s. High school students needed to do community service for their college applications, so there was an army of young people looking to do good deeds. Because everyone wanted to work in the soup kitchens, only kids from the most politically well-connected families were able to obtain one of these cushy spots. There simply weren't enough poor people to meet the demand of the do-gooders, and America has become a lot richer since then. If the man eating a rat so desired, he could find a rich college-bound high school student to give him a bath and soup whenever he wants. That would make a great college application essay. In reality, the homeless problem in America, not just New York, is almost entirely a problem of drugs and mental illness, and has little to do with the economy. And he goes on to give an anecdote and talks about the 1% getting most of the economic gains, which is true. And he also goes into tax rates and who pays in taxes and who doesn't and all this sort of thing. And then here it is. Yes. I have been sounding the alarm that the anti-woke right needs to appeal to elites. Mob rule by morons is not going to be successful in the long run. We need to ask why most smart people lean woke and come up with a message that can draw them away from the left. I have discussed elsewhere exactly how we can do this. Trumpists think that wokeism triumphed because it had power on its side. The way to defeat it is simply take power for ourselves and smash everything that leftists have built. Curtis Yarvin says we just need a king who will impose his point of view on society. Yarvin thinks the king should be J.D. Vance. Christopher Rufo calls for a power-first strategy. I say that this is backwards. Wokeism has power mainly because smart people were attracted to the ideology in the first place. Important institutions are staffed by cognitive elites, and because they lean woke, the elites use their positions of influence to advocate for wokeism. There's a limit to how much you can accomplish via pure bullying. Yes, you can fire government bureaucrats and strong-arm universities to axe their DEI staff, but you're not going to change anyone's views that way. You can't build effective alternative institutions with a bunch of Twitter trolls. The term fascist is used as a generic insult, but Trumpism has essentially become 1920s-style fascism. The original point of fascism was to combine nationalism with socialism under the leadership of an authoritarian state. Towards these ends, Mussolini ordered job-making public works projects and nationalist economic policies. Although it wasn't an explicit part of the ideology, fascism was also associated with thuggery, which is increasingly the MO of the Trump administration. If Trump goes through with his tariffs and isolationism, this will have many effects, but probably not the one that he intends, namely bringing back manufacturing jobs. Tariff policy has been changing on a weekly basis, and all of the tariffs could well be rescinded after Trump leaves office. No one is going to start building factories in the U.S. when they don't know what policies will be in place when the factory is ready to operate. As for negative effects, the tariffs have already crashed the stock market, and they will raise inflation. There's a high probability of stagnation plus inflation. Trump's economic warfare and nationalist rhetoric has discredited the MAGA movement in the eyes of the vast majority of non-Americans, thus weakening the MAGA-adjacent anti-woke right in other countries. For example, the Conservatives in Canada were on track for an easy victory in the next election, but are now losing after Trump kept threatening to annex their country. Trump's impending failure may set the stage for a left-wing backlash. If the next president is a Democrat, he or she, I wouldn't rule out AOC or someone like her, is going to use Trumpian means to undo what Trump did. This is one of the problems with Yarvin's king idea. What happens when the other side's king takes power? The past few decades have been in the era of Pax Americana. Uncle Sam runs around the world putting out fires, making everyone play nice, stamping out pandemics, and preventing the less enlightened countries from bringing back slavery or biological warfare. Uncle Sam also provides over the rules-based order that makes cooperation and free trade possible, and has enabled the long peace. America Firsters see us spending a small amount of money on other countries and demand that we cut off the freeloaders. But the consequences of the collapse of the international system will penetrate the borders of America. Pandemics in Haiti can't be kept out by a wall. If China decides to gobble up all of Asia, and maybe Africa too, it will eventually pose a threat to us, even given the false assumption that America can achieve autarky. Trump's plan to alienate our allies and abandon our historic world will create a poorer, more chaotic, more dangerous world for everyone. And here's what's funny. That's a Trump supporter who wrote that. Just sit with that for a minute. Now, I want to go through some interesting things on Twitter that I think are interesting in this whole conversation we're having on tariffs and global economics. I love this thread because it demonstrates something that is very important. One of the reasons we have trade deficits, i.e. we import more than we export, is because we're so stupidly rich. And this thread kind of talks about, like, we are incredible, and not only are we incredibly rich, our money has a lot of buying power, so we can buy a lot from other places, and really, be the engine dynamo of the world economy. It says here, median inflation-adjusted incomes have increased 50% since 1975. America owns 33% of all global wealth. Excluding Germany, France, UK, India, Japan, and China, we own 50% of all wealth. The median American is the top global 10% of wealth. Real GDP in the USA has outpaced every G7 nation since 1995. And it shows this map of our wealth of $145.8 trillion, the combined wealth of the rest of the country, excluding basically other industrialized powers, save parts of Europe. Literally, our country is as rich as everything you see in yellow. Not gray, those are excluded. Everything you see in yellow. That includes oil sheiks in the Middle East, all of Africa, all of South America, and literally all of Europe except Germany, France, and the UK. And most of Asia, except for India, China, and Japan. Globalization has been good for us. I mean, the problem is the bulk of that wealth has not reached the everyday person. That's really the problem. And that's demonstrated by this first reply. When was the last time you drove through rural Pennsylvania? I'd wager never, which explains why equating GDP figures that treat knowledge, work, and manufacturing as equal contributors to a country's economic strength is absurd. That's the general, when you post stuff like this, that's the general feeling that you get from people is, yeah, okay, so we're richer than everything in yellow. Who cares? I can't afford a house. I can't afford a car or a new truck. kids probably ain't going to college. I mean, and so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes, and so it goes. That the wealth that has been created has been so concentrated in the hands of a comparative few, and because it's expensive to live in a rich country, ask anyone who lives in Switzerland, because it's expensive to live in a rich country, it can feel like you're just not doing nearly as well as people in other places. And Trump definitely looks at trade deficits as, well, they're making money off of us, more money than we're making off of them. So we have to fix that. Well, no, not really. Because of our outsized wealth, are we able to have that? And much of the global financial system is entirely predicated on us running a trade deficit. And that has been true since 1947. Let's keep the conversation going. I love this one too. Now, this one has to do with the China aspect of this trade. Yeah. So, obviously, the big news out of the tariffs is, well, everyone else is negotiating, like Vietnam, who's offering 0 tariffs, and all this sort of thing, that now China has issued 34% retaliatory tariffs on everything the United States, imports to China. So basically, we now have tariffs on each other. We have 54%, they have 34%. It's basically a now high trade barrier between these two. And this person proposes that because China has a diversity of trading partners, it doesn't necessarily need the United States anymore. This is somewhat true. However, it's important to note, China has struggled to recover from the pandemic because we import so much less from China now. A lot of manufacturing moved to Vietnam, Malaysia, other places in Southeast Asia coming out of the pandemic. It's been several years now. It's had time to move. And so now we actually buy much less from China than we used to. It says here that China trades more with Southeast Asian countries than the USA. China has close relations with 52 nations in Africa. China leads trade in the Middle East and vast majority of developing countries around the globe. Meanwhile, the US is screwed without Chinese manufacturing. Walk through your house and see how many products are made in China. If Trump doesn't swallow his pride and immediately reverse positions, he won't, his ego's way too big, then this is the end of the US economy. I don't think that's true. Let's not be hyperbolic. It's, and it says, that additional 50% tariffs on China will be effective on April 9th. I think the aspect, I think China is trying to play the same game with Trump and see who blinks first. Trump wants to use, I think part of Trump's tariff strategy is to use tariffs as a cudgel to get better trading deals and get countries to reduce tariff barriers. Fair enough. It's a terrible strategy, but here we are. China is trying to see if they can get away with it too. I don't know they're going to be able to, simply for the fact of this reply here, which is correct. None of those countries have any purchasing power. Good luck replacing American consumers with Africans. China's economy is going to crash without exports to the U.S. Meanwhile, the U.S. can rebuild its manufacturing base and use friendly trade deals with Vietnam as a bridge to replace Chinese products. That's, I think, the more likely scenario, is that China's not going to have a ready, deep spending power consumer market to sell cheap goods to, and that will cause a lot of problems in China. We saw this a little bit last night already with the yuan devaluing overnight, and China letting it devalue when it's supposed to be pegged to the US dollar. Their currency, they have so much of it, and there's so little demand for it, it would be worth very little very quickly if that continues. But the China aspect of this tariff situation is very interesting because they're trying to get away with the same thing Trump is trying to do, but they're not in the position the U.S. is to get away with it, which I think is interesting. Let's continue. This aspect of it, we've kind of discussed it in the first article, but this was just interesting because I think this is why I think a lot of people are not necessarily afraid of this, and the statement is very simple here. This is why the libtard laptop class is slipping out over tariffs. Reshoring will transfer wealth generation from blue cities like New York back to the Rust Belt and other red-purple states. Hick libs and DEI hires see their obsolescence in an America that actually makes things. All of those fancy marketing and HR degrees you're still making loan payments on suddenly become worthless when the jobs are being a materials engineer in Dayton, Ohio, not a social community manager in Brooklyn. The status you worked for all your life is gone. This is bio-Leninism in action. Libtards are defending to the death the economic system, free trade, that lets them lord it over the chuds. In tariff world, they're not even qualified to mop floors because of how fat and sickly they are. They know this deep down. That's I mean, that's quite a, I mean, and the whole thread goes into all of this. And it is this idea that, as the first article talked about, this idea that if you are tough and work hard and make things, you're better and more dignified than someone who works on a laptop. Meanwhile, as I always tell people, who's going to run the HR, who's going to run the payroll, accounts receivable, accounts payable, supply line logistics, warehouse, like someone's got to run all of that, and it's probably going to be someone with a computer. Who's going to do the inside sales? Who's going to do the marketing? I mean, this is a dumb idea, but I wanted to read this by saying, and I'm certainly one of the people that he's talking about, I wanted to demonstrate this and talk about this because this is a lot of the debate that's been going on about this right now is this sort of tension between the growth in cities versus the not growth in the middle of the country. That is a huge part of Trump's base of support for this. That is what that's the new different economy that he's trying to create. I talked about that at Brains Magazine last week. This is what we're trying to do. I don't think it's going to work, but certainly this opinion, and when the stock market is going down, and when saying, oh, my retirement, my 401k, all this type of thing, you still have this dynamic of people saying, yeah, screw you. We want it to be good for us. And that understanding that popular idea is very important to understanding a lot about this tariff situation. Now, do I want to do this here? Nope. I want to kind of closing out the tariff discussion because we've been at it for almost a half hour. I want to get into what Europe's response is going to be. And so Europe's response has been 20% tariffs, which it would be at least for France and Germany, possibly the entire EU bloc, to counter the tariffs he has put against the EU. It says here, the European Union, the U.S.'s largest trading partner, vowed to retaliate after President Trump announced sweeping tariffs against the bloc in his bid to dismantle the global trading system. Trump, speaking from the White House on Wednesday, announced a 20% tariff on EU imports, which will take effect April 9th. He repeated his assertion that the 27 member states rip us off and called it pathetic. He unveiled different duties for certain countries, including a rate well above 50% for China. President Trump's announcement was a major blow to the world economy, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in a video address Thursday. We're preparing for further countermeasures to protect our interests and businesses if negotiations fail. Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs, which are not reciprocal, that's a whole thing. They literally took how much the trade deficit was and then set the tariffs based upon how much that country would need to buy from us to clear it up. And they literally just went through a list of countries on Grok or ChatGPT because they put a tariff on an island that only has penguins. I don't know how the penguins intend to pay their taxes, but here we are. Anyway. Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs are meant to target all the trade barriers U.S. exports face abroad, such as duties, domestic regulations, and taxes. Von der Leyen has previously said the EU holds a lot of cards, including retaliatory tariffs and targeting American services and technology companies. The American measures threaten to wipe out much of the euro area expansion the European Central Bank forecasts for this year and next. The impact on inflation is less clear-cut, which has kept ECB officials from committing to any outcome of their next policy meeting on April 17th. The latest U.S. measures come after Trump announced a 25% import tariff on steel and aluminum, as well as on cars and some auto parts. The EU announced a set of countermeasures up to 26 billion euros, $28.1 billion, in response to the metals duties, which are expected to enter into force in mid-April. Trump has said he'll announce other sectoral duties on products including lumber, pharmaceutical goods, and semiconductors. Trump has threatened to impose a 200% tariff on European wine, champagne, and other alcoholic beverages if the EU moves forward with a levy on American whiskey exports, currently due on April 14th. France and other countries have called on the Commission, which handles trade matters for the EU, to consider deploying the bloc's anti-coercion instrument, the EU's most powerful trade tool, designed to strike back against nations that use trade and economic measures coercively. The so-called ACI has never been deployed before, and it could lead to restrictions on trade and services, as well as intellectual property rights, foreign direct investment, and access to public procurement. EU trade ministers are due to meet on April 7th to discuss U.S. measures in the EU's response. Von der Leyen has promised a firm and proportionate response to the tariffs, but has also indicated that the EU would prefer to avoid a confrontation and find a negotiated solution in the coming weeks. Speaking after the president's announcement, his Treasury Secretary urged other countries not to fight back. "I wouldn't try to retaliate," Scott Bessent told Bloomberg Television. "As long as you don't retaliate, this is the high end of the number." The Commission is working on a term sheet of possible concessions it could make to the U.S. to help reach a settlement to remove or reduce duties. The term sheet would set out areas for negotiations on tariffs, mutual investments with the U.S., as well as easing certain regulations and standards. The EU's trade chief Maros Sefcovic traveled to Washington last week to discuss trade matters with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, U.S. Trade Representative Jamie Greer, and Director of the National Economic Council Kevin Hassett. He wasn't successful in heading off the new tariffs, but they began to map out the contours of a potential deal to reduce the duties. Non-tariff issues such as the value-added tax, digital taxes, and several EU regulations and food standards featured prominently during the talks in Washington. The EU says its VAT is fair, non-discriminatory tax that applies equally to domestic and imported goods. The Trump administration is focused on its attacks on what it considers to be unfair barriers to American products that the U.S. believes contribute to a transatlantic imbalance favoring Europe. The EU also raised the possibility of additional liquefied natural gas and defense-related purchases. European officials have stressed that even though the EU has a goods trade surplus with the U.S., the 27-nation bloc imports a lot of American services, ranging from e-commerce and social media sites to internet and search engines, all part of the U.S.'s big tech industry that has recently cozied up to Trump and his circle of advisors. EU and U.S. firms have more than 5 trillion euros worth of investment in each other's markets, according to the Commission. Germany is the most heavily exposed to Trump's actions due to its $92 billion trade surplus in goods with the U.S. in 2024, according to Eurostat. Its flagship car industry is particularly in focus, compounding the sector's struggle with a worsening position in China and the transition to electric vehicles. The trade setback will dampen expectations of a quick rebound from 2 years of contraction, just as Chancellor-in-Waiting Friedrich Merz prepares to ramp up spending on defense infrastructure to get the economy back on track. Yeah, well, this is all amid the pullback on the Ukraine war as well. That's also out there. With all these stories, we kind of forget all the other stuff that's going on. I mean, we're also Trump starts out with we're not supporting Ukraine as much, and we're pulling back from that, and Europe needs to step up with that, and so now you've got the tariff. Obviously Trump's message is the party is over, and we've known that for some time. That's not new. However, this is all really piling on as part of a greater, obviously, and this is true more of Scott Bessent, who has more cohesion than Trump does, a reset of the global order in so many ways. I just don't know that we're going to like to live in the one that we're building. It remains to be seen if that will work out or not. We'll live into the answer on that. I want to turn away from the tariff argument now, and I want to close out the remainder of the news hour talking about some other important things. And I want to start with the immediate consequences of ending USAID or USAID. This is in the New York Times. Trump's USAID cuts hobble earthquake response in Myanmar. While China, Russia, and other nations have rushed emergency response teams to the devastated country, the U.S., once a leader in foreign aid, has been slow to act. China, Russia, and India have dispatched emergency teams and supplies to earthquake-ravaged Myanmar, so have Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. The United States, the richest country in the world and once its most generous provider of foreign aid, has sent nothing. Even as President Trump was dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, he said that American help was on its way to Myanmar, where a 7.7 magnitude earthquake ripped through the country's heavily populated center on Friday. Last week, more than 1,700 people were killed, according to Myanmar's military government, with the death toll expected to climb steeply as more bodies are uncovered in the rubble and rescue teams search remote villages. But a 3-person U.S. aid assessment team is not expected to arrive until Wednesday. That would be 2 days from now. People with knowledge of the deployment efforts said. The overall American response has been slower than in normal circumstances. People who've worked on earlier disaster relief efforts as well as on aid to Myanmar said. Chinese search and rescue teams, complete with dogs trained to sniff out trapped people, are already on the ground in Mandalay, Myanmar's second largest city, and one of the places most deeply affected by the quake. China has pledged $14 million for Myanmar quake relief, sending 126 rescue workers and 6 dogs, along with medical kits, drones, and earthquake detectors. Being charitable and being seen as charitable serves American foreign policy, said Michael Schiffer, the assistant administrator of U.S. Aid Bureau for Asia from 2022 until earlier this year. If we don't show up and China shows up, that sends a pretty strong message. On Sunday, the U.S. Embassy in Myanmar announced on its website that the United States would provide up to $2 million in aid dispersed through humanitarian groups based in Myanmar. But most of the systems needed to funnel the American aid to Myanmar have been shattered. On Friday, as some employees in Washington and U.S. aid bureaus for humanitarian assistance were preparing a response to the earthquake, they received agency-wide layoff emails. Career diplomats working for U.S. aid and other employees have been bracing for layoffs for weeks. Trump political appointees in Washington had already fired most of the contractors working for the agency. The employees who received layoff notices were told they should go home that afternoon. Some had been coordinating with aid missions in Bangkok and Manila, which handled disaster response in Asia. 2 of the employees in Washington had expected to move this week to Yangon in Myanmar and to Bangkok to work as humanitarian assistance advisors out of the U.S. missions there. Both those positions were cut. Had they not been, the 2 employees would have been on the ground to organize urgent responses to the earthquake. After the disaster hit on Friday, the U.S. Embassy in Yangon sent a cable to USAID headquarters in Washington to start the process of evaluating aid needs and getting help out the door. And the next day, a Trump administration political appointee in USAID, Tim Meisberger, held a call with officials from national security agencies to discuss a plan. But Mr. Meisberger said that although there would be a response, no one should expect the agency's capabilities to be what they were in the past, said a person with direct knowledge of the call. A USAID spokesperson did not reply to a request for comment. And it goes into some of the details and how USAID was less than 1% of the budget. It says here also, the United States' ability to provide life-saving aid has been hampered not just by budget cuts, but by obstacles in Myanmar itself. Since grabbing power in 2021, Myanmar's military junta has closed off the country from Western influences. Myanmar is now embroiled in civil war, with a loose coalition of opposition forces having wrested control of more than half the country's territory. The United States and other Western nations have responded to the junta's brutal human rights record with sanctions, and the military chief who orchestrated the coup, Senator Ming Aung, has rallied against the West, thanking China and Russia for ideological and economic support. Nevertheless, in the hours after the earthquake struck, General Min Aung Hlaing said he welcomed outside disaster relief aid and not just from countries with friendly relations with the military regime. Myanmar experts say they are concerned that some of the aid that goes through the junta could be diverted to the armed forces. The Myanmar military is underfunded and unsure on morale as it fights resistance forces on many fronts. In Mandalay, residents said they were upset to see soldiers lounging around the sites of collapsed buildings. Some played video games on their phones, while locals used their hands to pry bricks from the rubble. Still, Chinese and Russian search and rescue teams outfitted in orange and blue uniforms were digging through the wreckage in Mandalay on Sunday, and a Belgian squad was making its way north. A good chunk of USAID funding has been dedicated to areas of the country not under junta control. American assistance has gone to healthcare and schooling for the internally displaced people. It has supported local administrations that are trying to form mini governments in conflict areas, and has tried to provide emergency relief to civilians battered by junta airstrikes. It says here, Mr. Aung Kyaw said that he did not expect foreigners, American or otherwise, to be able to alleviate the situation. Sargang has suffered for 4 years, and its people have died by the thousands in fighting the junta. Foreign aid, he said, would most likely end up benefiting the military regime, not those who most need it. In the end, we have only ourselves, he said. We've been resisting for 4 years now, and we'll have to find our own way forward, no matter what. And that's what happens when you pull back. Now, you can have your own opinions on whether that's a good idea or not. I happen to think it's not a very good one. But whatever your opinions might be, the reality is this is what happens when you pull back. For your consideration. Now, before we get into the Venezuela situation, I don't highlight my own work very often. But this week in my What the Hell is Going On collection, I want to talk a little bit about my new article on preventing domestic terrorism. Now, let me set the scene for you. In grad school, studied terrorism and asymmetrical warfare, and I studied domestic terrorism quite extensively, which got into things like Ruby Ridge, Waco, school shootings, Timothy, Oklahoma City, all of it. I studied all of it a great deal. And one of the things in the literature at the time, and this was a long time ago, but it's still true, is the lack of a domestic counterterrorism agency. This job usually falls to the FBI. Because the FBI is a law enforcement organization, it does this very poorly. And so when it comes to things like synagogue shootings, church shootings, all this type of thing, we just don't have the internal facilities to really do that well. This was gonna go in my reissue of What the Hell is Going On that was canceled, but I still wanted to highlight this article because when we start getting into things like Antifa, January 6th, how to stop domestic terrorism, even getting into, radicalized militias, like, these sort of citizens militias and all this sort of thing, I kind of go through how we do this, how important they are to sort of the base of the country, why people continue to know them, why people, really respect them, honor them, all this type of thing, and how they cemented power, particularly in the 19th century, and particularly during Reconstruction. And how they also, very similar to like the Brown Shirts in Nazi Germany or other asymmetrical organizations, support the local population with parades, events, food banks, all this type of thing. And how, these organizations are part and parcel of the American story, but how they can very quickly become very, very dangerous. And so I kind of go through all of this history. It's a bit of a long read because it was for a book. So it's a long essay, and I go through some recommendations of how to stop it, how to use the technology of social media to help track intelligence better, and why other countries have it and we don't. So if you haven't checked this out, you should. It's right on the front page of the Cameron Journal. I would really, really appreciate it. So, now, and I love this picture too. It's a lot of fun. So I now want to turn to the situation in Venezuela. Well, the situation with the Venezuelans who are in El Salvador. So now, breaking news, I should say, the Supreme Court has let Trump deport the Venezuelans to El Salvador. Here we are, sort of thing. So and this has all gone down to a man who was unfairly deported. Here it says here, the Trump administration acknowledged in a court filing Monday, that's today, or was it? Yeah. That it had grabbed a Maryland father with protected legal status and mistakenly deported him to El Salvador, but said that the U.S. courts lacked jurisdiction to order his return from the mega prison where he's now locked up. The case appears to be the first time the Trump administration has admitted to errors when it sent 3 plane loads of Salvadoran and Venezuelan deportees to El Salvador's grim terrorism confinement center on March 15th. Attorneys for several Venezuelan deportees have said that the Trump administration falsely labeled their clients as gang members because of their tattoos. Trump officials have disputed those claims. I'm not going to pay for the Atlantic still. I'm going to switch over to this Twitter thread. This is very interesting. And this is from last week. Trump's lawyers are arguing that because they've dumped this guy in a Salvadoran prison, he can't file a habeas corpus petition because he's no longer in American custody. They're arguing that once you get sent to El Salvador, no court can order the government to bring you back. And this was from the original story in The Atlantic. It says here, the administration's lawyers are inadvertently explaining why it's illegal for the government to deport people to El Salvador without a hearing. If the government can't be forced to bring someone back if they've been sent erroneously, you have to make sure people aren't sent erroneously. Trump's lawyers are straight out of Catch-22. In one case, they're saying judges can't interfere with the deportation flights because the proper remedy is a habeas petition, but they're also arguing that once someone has been deported, they can't file a habeas petition. Horrible. The logic of the administration's position, by the way, means that it believes that an American citizen Trump deported in error to Salvador could not file a habeas petition either, since he too would no longer be in U.S. custody. So the administration is saying that if it dumped citizens in that El Salvador prison, there'd be no way for courts to order them to bring the citizens home. That's a trash authoritarian position to take. What's especially ludicrous about Trump's argument in this case is that we're paying Bukele to keep these people in his prison. So the claim that we don't have custody of them is semantic. We sent them to El Salvador, arranged for their detention, and are paying the bill. Of the guy, they're saying he's a member of MS-13. His name is Abrego Garcia, and obviously the first reply is like, oh yeah, he's had a bond issue since 2019. It says he was denied bond but granted an order withholding removal and has been living in Maryland for the past 6 years, making annual reporting check-ins with ICE. The MS-13 ID was also flimsy. He's supposedly an MS-13 member who has no criminal record in the 14 years he's lived here, and he was identified as a gang member based on his clothes and a detective's account of on the word of a confidential informant. And what's the craziest thing about this whole story that's been going on for weeks now is that people say, oh, well, a citizen would never get deported because there's a process for that. And then what they're saying is, no, there's not. Which means if he doesn't have due process, no one does. Now, we can argue about whether it's good to send illegal immigrants to foreign prisons and get rid of gang members. That's a whole separate discussion. When it comes to process, in terms of identifying who's a citizen, who's not, and where they should go, this is very important. And Trump is saying, no, it's not. And unfortunately, based upon this here, the Supreme Court is saying that's fine. It says here that the U.S. Supreme Court allowed President Donald Trump to resume deporting alleged Venezuelan gang members under the Alien Enemies Act on a 5-4 vote. Granting emergency request to Trump on a 5-4 vote, the justices tossed out a lower court order that had paused deportations under the Alien Enemies Act while litigation continues. The majority said detainees must have, quote, an opportunity to challenge their removal in court before they are deported. In an unsigned opinion, the court downplayed the significance of its decision, saying that it was requiring only that detainees challenge their deportation through a so-called habeas corpus case filed in the jurisdiction where they are being held. The majority didn't address arguments that many people have been deported without having a chance to argue that they aren't gang members. Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined the three liberals in dissent. Trump has made unprecedented use of the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, a law previously invoked only in the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. The measure lets the president bypass federal immigration law to deport alien enemies when the U.S. is involved in a declared war or a foreign nation started or threatened an invasion or predatory incursion. The administration has already invoked the Alien Enemies Act to ship more than 130 alleged members of the Tren de Aragua gang to a prison in El Salvador on March 15th, even though U.S. District Judge James Boasberg orally ordered 2 planes carrying the Venezuelans to turn around mid-flight. The judge is now considering whether the government violated his orders. This whole situation is insane. It's extremely authoritarian. We usually sanction regimes who do this. And I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. doesn't get sanctions in the midst of the trade war we're in over something like this, which is clearly, the value of the rule of law is that no matter who gets to make use of it. And if one person doesn't get any, then none of us get any. And that's a huge problem. And the comment section is mostly focused on, we're getting rid of the terrorist criminals, not on the how it's being done or anything like that, which is understandable. I'm not surprised. That's where most people would go along with it, for sure. But that is unfortunately where we're at. It's a very frightening day on multiple fronts, I think, and for all parties involved. Anyway. That's me. I'm going to sign off. It's 57 minutes into the broadcast, 54 minutes before the hour. Thank you all so much. Let me change back to the default. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. Please head over to CameronJournal.com for all your all my social links, at Cameron Cowan on Twitter and Instagram, at Cameron Journal on TikTok and Blue Sky. Happy to interact with you there. Don't forget to sign up to the newsletter. Head just over to CameronJournal.com. There's a pop-up. And like I said, if you want to support the work, sign up for Cameron Journal Plus. It's only $5. So that would be definitely fantastic. And check out courses if you're interested in keeping the learning going. So that's all for me this week. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the interviews. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next week on the Cameron Journal Podcast. Good night.